My daughter said I was too fragile, too forgetful, and too much of a liability to live upstairs, so she locked me in the basement for my own safety and told everyone I'd chosen to isolate myself. But I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't helpless. And while she thought I'd wither away in that concrete tomb, grateful for her protection, I was building something else. Something that would trap her in walls far stronger than the ones she built around me. This is how I turned my daughter's sanctuary into her own personal hell without ever leaving that basement. Because sometimes the most powerful prison isn't made of locks and concrete. It's made of the choices you can't escape and the truth you can't outrun. I built my life around giving. Not the kind that expects applause, but the quiet kind that happens when no one's watching. When my daughter Margaret was 7 and scared of the dark, I slept on her bedroom floor for 6 months until the fear passed. When she was 16 and crashed my only car, I took 3 buses to work for a year so she could drive to college prep classes. I never mentioned it. Love doesn't keep receipts. I sold my mother's pearl necklace to pay for Margaret's wedding dress. I postponed my hip surgery twice because she needed help with her newborn twins. When her husband Richard lost his job, I emptied my vacation fund without blinking. They lived with me for 2 years, and I never once made them feel like guests. That's what mothers do. We expand until there's room for everyone except ourselves. The house on Willow Street had been mine for 37 years. Every creaking floorboard knew my footsteps. Every window held my fingerprints from decades of morning cleaning. The kitchen smelled permanently of vanilla extract and cinnamon because I baked bread every Sunday, even when my arthritis made kneading feel like warfare. Margaret used to say the scent of my house was what home meant to her. I taught piano lessons in the living room to supplement my pension. My students were mostly neighborhood kids who needed more than music. They needed someone to notice them. Mrs. Chen's grandson, Timothy, came twice a week and always stayed for cookies. The Morrison twins practiced their scales while telling me about school. That house wasn't just walls and memories. It was a lighthouse for everyone who needed one. But bodies betray us, don't they? The first fall happened in the shower. Nothing dramatic, just a slip that reminded me I was 78. The second one was on the stairs, carrying laundry I insisted on doing myself. Margaret found me that time, and I saw something shift in her eyes. Not concern, calculation. "Mom, we need to talk about safety," she said, holding my hand with fingers that felt like a verdict. I thought she meant grab bars, maybe a shower seat. I thought she meant care. I didn't know she was already measuring the basement, planning my disappearance while smiling at me across my own kitchen table. The changes started small, like drops of poison in sweet tea. Margaret began visiting more often, always with her laptop, always with questions. "Mom, where do you keep the deed to the house?" she'd ask while refilling my coffee. "Just updating my files," she'd say. "You know, in case of emergencies." She brought Richard along more frequently. He'd taken a new job, financial planning, he said, and suddenly had opinions about my utilities, my property taxes, my inefficient use of space. He walked through my house like an appraiser, opening closets, checking the attic, measuring rooms with his eyes. I caught him in my bedroom once, photographing my jewelry box. "Insurance purposes," he mumbled. Then came the doctor visits. Margaret insisted on driving me, sitting in on appointments I'd handled alone for decades. She'd interrupt, telling Dr. Patterson about falls I'd never had, confusion that didn't exist. "She called me Jennifer yesterday." She lied smoothly. Jennifer was her sister who died 10 years ago. I sat there, too stunned to correct her in the moment, and my silence became evidence. The basement renovation started in April. "It's perfect for you, Mom," Margaret chirped, showing me paint samples. "Your own little apartment. No stairs to worry about. Everything on one level." She made it sound like a gift. They installed a bathroom, a kitchenette, even a separate entrance. I thought it was thoughtful. I helped pick the curtains. What I didn't know was that Margaret had been studying elder law, specifically the statutes about establishing residency and control. She'd found a lawyer who specialized in difficult family transitions. I saw the business card once, tucked in her purse. Compassionate solutions for aging parents. Even exploitation had euphemisms now. One morning, I overheard Margaret on the phone in my garden. "Yes, we've documented everything. The basement conversion is complete. Once she's settled there, we can start renovating upstairs for the rental units." Rental units. In my house. I stood behind my roses, gripping the pruning shears until my knuckles went white. That night at dinner, Margaret smiled her practiced smile. "Mom, we've been thinking. Summer's coming and those stairs. Why don't you try out the basement apartment? Just temporarily, until we can install better railings upstairs." Temporarily. The word tasted like ash. But she'd been so convincing at the doctor's office, I wondered if maybe I was becoming forgetful. Maybe I did need help. I nodded, still trusting the daughter I'd raised, still believing love meant something. The move happened on a Thursday in late June. Margaret arrived with boxes, packing tape, and 3 men in matching t-shirts. "Professional organizers," she explained, already directing them upstairs. "We'll just take the essentials down first." I watched my life disappear into boxes labeled in someone else's handwriting. My grandmother's china, my photo albums, my father's war medals, everything vanished upstairs for safekeeping. They left me with the minimum: a week's worth of clothes, my blood pressure medication, some books I'd already read. "The piano?" I asked when they started covering it with blankets. "Too heavy for the basement stairs," Richard said, not meeting my eyes. "We'll keep it safe up here." By evening, I was sitting on a new bed in a room that smelled like fresh paint and defeat. Margaret hung a cheerful calendar on the wall, kissed my forehead, and headed for the door. That's when I heard it, the soft click of a lock engaging from the outside. My heart stuttered. "Margaret?" I called out, moving to the door. The handle wouldn't turn. "The door seems to be stuck." She paused on the other side. "It's for your safety, Mom. So you don't wander at night. I'll be down first thing in the morning." Wander? I'd never wandered in my life. I pressed my palm against the door, feeling the cold metal of a deadbolt that hadn't been there during the renovation tours. The separate entrance she'd promised? I rushed to check, sealed from the outside with a padlock. The windows I'd helped choose curtains for? Painted shut. My hand shook as I picked up the phone she'd installed. It had no dial tone, just a single button that connected to one number. Hers. I sat on the edge of the bed as darkness fell, listening to footsteps above me. In my kitchen, in my living room, strangers' feet on floors I'd polished for decades. They were still there at midnight, moving furniture, talking in low voices. I heard Richard laugh, heard glasses clinking, heard Margaret say something about finally having space. I pressed my ear to the heating vent, trying to understand. A woman's voice drifted down, Richard's mother, Sandra, who'd always resented how much Margaret relied on me. "How long before you can legally rent out the upstairs?" "Mom needs to be down there at least 6 months, Margaret replied. "Then we can claim she's mentally incompetent, that she chose isolation. The documentation is already in place." 6 months, trapped in this basement, while they lived in my house above me. I wasn't their mother anymore. I was their income strategy. The twins, my granddaughters, were only 8 years old, too young to understand why Grandma had suddenly disappeared. The full scope of their plan revealed itself in pieces over the following days. Through the heating vents, my only window to the world above, I heard everything. Margaret on conference calls with contractors, planning to convert my 3-bedroom home into rental units. $4,000 a month? Easy, she told Richard. More if we furnish them. The doctor visits made sense now. Every interrupted appointment, every false claim of confusion. She'd been building a case. I found documents in the desk drawer, left there carelessly, competency evaluations with forged signatures, medical power of attorney forms I'd never seen, bank statements showing transfers I hadn't authorized. The cruelest part was the performance. Every morning, Margaret would unlock the door, bring me breakfast, and chat like nothing was wrong. She'd ask about my sleep, check my blood pressure, update me on the twins, all while knowing she'd imprisoned me. She'd installed a baby monitor behind a picture frame. I found it when I noticed the tiny red light blinking in the dark. "Mom's doing so well," I heard her tell someone on the phone. "She loves her little apartment. So much safer than those stairs. Yes, she's eating well. No visitors. She needs complete rest." The neighbors must have asked about me. Through the vents, I caught fragments. Mrs. Chen wondering why I'd canceled piano lessons, the Morrison family asking if I was ill. Margaret had answers for everyone. I was recuperating. I was too fragile for visitors. I'd chosen solitude for my health, always said with such concern, such daughterly devotion. One evening, I heard them discussing my will. The will I'd updated 2 years ago, leaving everything to Margaret in trust for the twins. But they spoke of a different will, one leaving everything to Margaret alone, dated just last month. My signature was on it, apparently. A signature I'd never written. They were meticulous about the performance of my decline. Margaret kept a log, noting confusion episodes that never happened, refusal to bathe when she never gave me the chance, aggressive behavior when I'd done nothing but sit quietly, building a paper trail for the inevitable court hearing. The basement wasn't just my cage, it was their waiting room. They were waiting for me to deteriorate, to prove their lies true. Or perhaps they were waiting for something else. Richard mentioned life insurance policies I didn't remember having. Margaret hushed him quickly, but I heard enough. They weren't just stealing my house and freedom, they were betting on my death. 3 weeks into my imprisonment, something inside me shifted. I'd been lying on the narrow bed, staring at water stains on the ceiling, when I heard my piano being played upstairs. Badly. Someone was butchering Bach with clumsy fingers and no soul. My piano, that I'd saved for 5 years to buy, that I'd taught hundreds of children on, was being abused by someone who didn't even know how to hold their wrists properly. That's when the fog of despair burned away. Rage, clean, cold, and clarifying, took its place. They thought I was a helpless old woman, but I'd survived worse than this. I'd buried a husband, raised a daughter alone, fought off cancer twice. I wasn't going to rot in this basement while they celebrated above me. I began to really observe my surroundings. They'd made mistakes. Arrogant people always do. The heating vents that carried their voices down also worked in reverse. The old landline wiring was still in the walls. I could see the phone jack they'd painted over. The basement windows, while sealed, were original to the house. Single pane, old frames that I knew had weak points. But I wasn't planning to escape. Running would make me look exactly like the confused old woman they'd painted me as. No, I needed to be smarter. Margaret thought she knew me, but she'd forgotten that I'd raised her. I knew her passwords. She'd used variations of the twins' birthdays for everything. I knew her routines, her weaknesses, her fears. Most importantly, I remembered something she'd overlooked. The house was held in trust. My late husband had insisted on it, with his brother James as co-trustee. Margaret thought James was senile, living in a nursing home in Seattle. But I'd gotten a Christmas card from him just last year. He was in assisted living by choice, sharp as ever, playing poker and flirting with widows. That night, I started documenting everything. Not in a journal they might find, but in places they'd never look. Inside pill bottles, written in tiny script, on the backs of food labels, under drawer linings, evidence of my clarity, their crimes, the truth they were so carefully burying. I also noticed something else. The furnace maintenance was due. Tom Kowalski had serviced it for 15 years, always in July. His daughter Emily had been one of my piano students. Margaret didn't know about the service contract. I'd always handled it, which meant Tom would come looking for access soon. My first ally was about to arrive, and Margaret had no idea. The prisoner they'd underestimated was about to become the warden of their fate. Tom Kowalski arrived on a Tuesday morning in July. I heard Margaret fussing upstairs, caught off guard by his appearance. Through the vent, she told Richard she'd forgotten about the service appointment. They debated sending him away, but the furnace had been making concerning noises. When Tom came downstairs, I was ready. I'd written a message on the inside of a medicine label. "Tom, I'm being held against my will. Don't react. Not if you understand. Come back." I slipped it to him while pointing at the furnace. His eyes widened, but he kept working. He nodded once, slowly. When he spoke, it was louder than necessary. "Just checking the filters, Mrs. Hartley. Everything looks good down here." Then quietly, "I'll help." He did. 2 days later, there was another emergency, a gas leak that required immediate inspection. This time, Tom brought his supervisor. Then came a city inspector for routine safety checks. Each visit, I passed more notes, more evidence. Tom's niece worked at Adult Protective Services. His supervisor's wife was a paralegal. Quietly, my network grew. Meanwhile, I explored every inch of my prison. Behind the water heater, I found what they'd missed: an old access panel to the crawl space. Years of paint had sealed it, but paint chips when you work at it steadily. It led to the original coal cellar, forgotten during renovations. In that dusty space, I discovered something valuable: the house's original electrical panel, still connected, though no longer the main box. Richard only knew about the modern panel upstairs. This one still controlled certain circuits, including the security system they'd installed to monitor me. More importantly, the coal cellar connected to the old root cellar, and from there, a narrow passage led to the bulkhead doors in the backyard. Doors they'd forgotten existed, hidden under years of ivy growth. I didn't clear them yet. Knowledge was my advantage. I'd use it when the time was right. During Margaret's morning visits, I played my part perfectly. Confused just enough to match her narrative, but not so much that she'd accelerate her plans. I forgot the twins' names occasionally, then remembered them clearly. I complained about the food, then praised it, keeping her off balance, unsure. At night, I practiced moving silently through the hidden spaces. I found my father's old toolbox, overlooked and dust-covered. Inside were duplicate keys to locks they hadn't changed, interior doors that still had their original hardware beneath the new deadbolts. By early August, I had mapped every vulnerability in their plan. Tom had connected me with Ms. Williams from APS. The investigation was beginning, but slowly, carefully. We needed more than my word against theirs. We needed proof they couldn't deny. That proof would come from their own arrogance, because while I prepared in darkness, they celebrated in light, never suspecting the foundation beneath them was already crumbling. My first real victory came through patience and Richard's stupidity. He'd grown comfortable, careless. Every morning after Margaret left with the twins, he worked from home in what used to be my sewing room, now his office. He always had coffee at 9:30, bathroom break at 9:35, back by 9:40. Like clockwork. On August 15th, I made my move. Using the coal cellar passage, I emerged through the interior basement door they'd forgotten to lock. Why would they, when I was already locked in? Richard's laptop sat open, logged in, unguarded. 5 minutes was all I needed. His files were a confession written in spreadsheets, emails to contractors about the future rental property, correspondence with Margaret about managing mother's decline, financial projections based on my life expectancy. Most damning, a folder labeled insurance containing policies I'd never purchased, with premiums paid from my own accounts. I didn't print anything, too risky. Instead, I used Richard's phone to photograph everything, then uploaded it all to a cloud account I created. grandmaknows2023@gmail.com. Then I did something else. I logged into my bank accounts. Margaret had changed the passwords, but not the security questions. She'd never paid attention when I told her stories about my childhood. The accounts were nearly empty, systematic transfers to Margaret's name labeled home care expenses. But I wasn't there for the money. I was there to add Tom Kowalski and James as authorized contacts on the accounts. Small changes that would matter later. Before leaving, I moved Richard's coffee mug 2 inches to the left and turned his mousepad slightly. Tiny changes that would gnaw at him. Back in my basement prison, I listened through the vents as he returned, heard his confusion. "Margaret, did you come home? Someone's been in here." She dismissed him, but I heard the new edge in their conversations. Paranoia had entered their perfect plan. Over the following days, I made more subtle adjustments during my brief freedoms. A photo frame faced the wrong way. A bookmark moved to a different page. Never enough to prove anything, just enough to destabilize. The beauty was in their response. They installed cameras upstairs, changed locks, added alarms, all focused on external threats while the real danger was already inside. They were so busy looking out, they stopped looking down. Ms. Williams visited the following week, armed with the information Tom had passed along. When Margaret tried to refuse entry, Ms. Williams simply said, "We've received concerning reports. You can cooperate, or I can return with law enforcement." The inspection was thorough. Margaret tried to control it, but Ms. Williams insisted on seeing everything. When they reached my door, Margaret's hand shook as she unlocked it. "Just checking on Mom," she said brightly. "She prefers privacy." I sat in my chair, wearing the same clothes I'd worn for days, and let my appearance tell its own story. The victory was small but significant. The first crack in Margaret's facade, the first official doubt about her narrative. The APS investigation accelerated everything. Ms. Williams was thorough, interviewing neighbors who contradicted Margaret's story. Mrs. Chen mentioned how strange it was that I'd abruptly stopped teaching piano. The Morrison family confirmed I'd been mentally sharp just weeks before vanishing into the basement. Margaret's response was predictable. She tried to accelerate her timeline. I heard her on the phone with a memory care facility, pushing for immediate placement. "My mother's deteriorating rapidly," she lied. "She's becoming violent." But I'd anticipated this. Through Tom, I'd already contacted James in Seattle. One phone call from him to the family lawyer revealed the trust issue. No major decisions about the house without both trustees' consent. Margaret had been forging his signature too. The legal machinery began turning. A court-appointed evaluator was assigned to assess my competency. Margaret tried to coach me beforehand, suggesting I was confused about dates and sometimes mixed up the twins with other children. I nodded along, then performed perfectly for the evaluator, answering every question with precision. Meanwhile, I escalated the psychological warfare. Using my secret access during Richard's clockwork breaks, I left subtle signs throughout the house. Margaret's anxiety medication went missing, then reappeared in the freezer. Richard's important client files were mysteriously reorganized. They blamed each other, fought constantly. The stress was cracking their united front. But the real execution came through documentation. Every conversation overheard through the vents was recorded in my hidden notes. Every forged document was photographed during my brief excursions upstairs. The cloud account grew heavy with evidence. Sandra, Richard's mother, became an unexpected ally, not intentionally, but through her greed. She pushed too hard for her cut of the eventual profits, threatening to expose them if she didn't get a larger share. I heard the argument through the vents, recorded every damning word in my pill bottle diary. Thieves turning on each other, nothing more predictable or useful. By late August, multiple agencies were involved. APS, the Police Fraud Unit, the Elder Abuse Task Force. Margaret was scrambling, trying to maintain her story while the walls closed in. She made a fatal error, attempting to have me declared incompetent before the investigation concluded. The judge, already alerted by James and armed with the evaluator's report, not only denied the request but ordered a full audit of my finances. The house of cards was collapsing. Margaret just didn't know yet that I held the match that would burn it all down. The evidence was gathered, the allies in place. All that remained was the final move, one they'd never see coming because they'd forgotten the most important thing about their prisoner. I wasn't just a mother they'd betrayed. I was a woman who'd survived everything life threw at her. And I was about to teach them that the elderly don't just fade away. Sometimes they rise up and reclaim everything stolen from them, with interest. The morning of September 3rd started like any other. Margaret brought my breakfast, checked my blood pressure, and left for her morning errands. What she didn't know was that Judge Harrison had signed an emergency order the night before. What I didn't know was that Margaret had already booked my transfer to a memory care facility for that very afternoon. I was documenting evidence in the crawl space when I heard vehicles outside. Multiple vehicles. Through the ventilation, I heard Margaret's panicked voice on the phone with Richard. "They're here! The police are here!" But downstairs, I heard other sounds. Medical transport workers discussing the patient pickup and secured facility protocols. Two operations were colliding, the legal intervention and Margaret's desperate final move. I made a choice that surprised everyone, including myself. When the medical transport workers arrived at my door, sent by Margaret to remove me before the police could intervene, I went willingly. Smiled sadly, played the confused elder perfectly. "If my daughter says it's best," I mumbled, letting them help me pack. Margaret's relief was palpable, even as police questioned her upstairs. She thought she'd won, getting me out before they could interview me properly. What she didn't realize was that I'd already triggered my final safeguard. You see, James hadn't just been sitting in Seattle. After my contact, he'd hired a private investigator who'd been documenting everything for weeks. The facility Margaret chose was 40 miles away, outside local jurisdiction, but not beyond the reach of federal elder abuse laws. Every forged document she'd used crossed state lines. Every fraudulent transfer became a federal crime. As they led me to the medical transport van, I saw Tom Kowalski's truck parked across the street. Ms. Williams's car around the corner. FBI agents in an unmarked van. James had connections from his military days. All waiting, all watching, all recording Margaret's final crime. Interstate kidnapping of a vulnerable adult. The facility was actually nice, as prisons go. Clean, well-lit, staffed by people who seemed to care. Margaret kissed my cheek at intake, promised to visit soon, then drove away thinking she'd solved her problem. She made it exactly 3 miles before the FBI pulled her over. I spent one night in that facility, long enough to establish the kidnapping charge, to document the fraudulent admission papers Margaret had filed, to let her think she'd won. The next morning, Agent Davidson arrived with a court order and a competency evaluation that proved what everyone except Margaret already knew. I was completely sound of mind. But here's the beautiful part. I didn't go home. Not yet. I checked into a hotel, the luxury suite Margaret always called wasteful, and watched the news unfold. Local woman arrested in federal elder abuse case. Financial fraud and kidnapping charges filed. Margaret's mugshot looked exactly like I'd imagined. Desperate, confused, unable to understand how her perfect plan had unraveled. She'd thought removing me from the house would stop the investigation. Instead, she'd elevated it to federal crimes with mandatory minimums. Sometimes the best trap is the one your enemy sets for themselves. The collapse was swift and complete. Within 48 hours of Margaret's arrest, Richard tried to flee with the twins to his mother's house in Michigan. The FBI intercepted him at the state line. Sandra, suddenly realizing her own legal exposure, tried to claim ignorance but crumbled when presented with recordings of her demanding a share of the profits. I returned to my house on September 7th, escorted by federal agents who needed to document the crime scene. The basement prison was photographed from every angle: the exterior locks, the painted windows, the baby monitor, the phone that only called one number. Each detail became another count in the indictment. The house felt different, violated. Margaret's things were everywhere: her files in my sewing room, her clothes in my closet, her plans spread across my dining table. But underneath the invasion, my home remained. My piano, dusty but intact. My garden, overgrown but alive. My life, stolen but not destroyed. The twins were placed with Richard's sister Amy in Minnesota, the only family member who'd questioned Margaret's story. Amy called me, crying, apologizing for not doing more. I told her to focus on the children. They needed stability, love, truth. 8-year-olds shouldn't pay for their parents' crimes. The legal proceedings were thorough. Federal charges: elder abuse, kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy. State charges: false imprisonment, financial exploitation, forgery. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just my documentation, but their own digital trail. Margaret had been so confident, she'd never deleted anything. Richard's employer fired him immediately. Their house, mortgaged beyond value, went into foreclosure within a month. The life they'd built on my supposed death crumbled like sand. But the most satisfying moment came during Margaret's bail hearing. She stood there in orange, her attorney arguing for release, when the prosecutor presented my journal. The pill bottle notes, the food label documentation, the photos I'd taken during my secret excursions. The judge read excerpts aloud, my words describing the imprisonment, the theft, the casual cruelty of being erased by your own child. Bail denied, he said. The defendant poses a flight risk and a danger to the victim. Margaret looked at me then, searching for the mother who'd always forgiven everything. But forgiveness requires repentance, and her eyes held only rage at being caught. I looked back steadily, then turned to watch her led away. Some bridges, once burned, light the way forward. The community rallied around me. Mrs. Chen brought daily meals. The Morrison family helped me reconnect my piano students. Tom Kowalski refused payment for the furnace work that had saved my life. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were guardians, making sure no one would ever isolate me again. I reclaimed my house room by room. The basement, scene of my imprisonment, became my project. I had the locks removed, the doors taken off completely, painted the walls in bright yellows and blues, installed proper windows that opened wide. What had been a prison became a music room where I taught free lessons to children whose families couldn't afford them. The piano sang again under my fingers and those of my students. Timothy Chen returned first, hugging me so tight I could barely breathe. The Morrison twins had practiced during my absence, eager to show me their progress. New students came too. Word spread that Mrs. Hartley was teaching again, and my calendar filled with young voices and clumsy fingers finding their rhythm. Margaret pled guilty to avoid trial. The federal charges alone carried 15 years. With the plea, she got 8 years federal time, 5 years state time to run concurrently, and restitution that would follow her forever. Richard got 5 years and his own financial ruin. Sandra, investigation revealed, had done this before in another state. Elder fraud was her specialty. She got 7 years federal time. I attended Margaret's sentencing. She'd written a letter to the judge, blaming mental health issues, postpartum depression, financial stress, everything but her own choices. When given the chance to speak to me, she said, "I'm sorry you feel hurt." Not sorry for what she did, sorry for how I felt about it. I responded simply, "I'm not hurt. I'm free. You're the one in a cage now." The house felt too big for just me, so I made changes. The upstairs became a rotating home for music students who needed temporary housing, college kids aging out of foster care, young mothers escaping bad situations. They paid what they could, helped with maintenance, and filled the house with life again. The twins' college funds, which Margaret had drained, were restored through the restitution and a GoFundMe the community organized. Amy brought them to visit every few months. Difficult visits at first. They'd been told so many lies. But children recognize love when it's real. By Christmas, they were calling me Grandma again, playing chopsticks on the piano, helping me bake cookies. I also started speaking. Senior centers, community groups, anywhere people would listen. Elder abuse thrives in silence and shame. I refused both. My story became a warning, a rallying cry, proof that age doesn't mean weakness. The local news did a follow-up story. Woman imprisoned in basement becomes advocate for elder rights. James flew in from Seattle for my 80th birthday. We updated all the trust documents, added multiple safeguards, created a foundation for elder abuse victims. Margaret would inherit nothing, but her daughters would have their education funded. Sins of the mother shouldn't poison the next generation. 5 years have passed since my daughter tried to erase me. 5 years of mornings in my own kitchen, teaching music in the afternoon, evening walks in my garden. The basement music room echoes with children's laughter, where once I counted the hours in darkness. The house breathes again, full of students and guests and life. Margaret serves her time in federal prison, 2 states away. She wrote once, after 3 years, a letter full of justifications and accusations. I read it to my lawyer, filed it away, and didn't respond. Some doors, once locked from the outside, should stay closed from within. The twins are 13 now, thriving with Amy's family. They know the truth, age-appropriate versions of it. They understand their mother made terrible choices, that love doesn't excuse cruelty. But they also know they're not defined by her actions. They visit every summer, help in the garden, play piano duets with me. There's healing in their laughter. Richard works minimum wage jobs, most of his earnings going to restitution. He aged 20 years in 2, his schemes having devoured any future he'd imagined. Sandra died in prison last year. A stroke, they said. I didn't attend the funeral, but I didn't celebrate either. Wasted lives deserve pity, not satisfaction. The basement entrance now has a sign, Hartley Music Academy, where every voice matters. 23 students currently take lessons, some paying, some on scholarship. The walls hold their artwork, photos from recitals, certificates of achievement. What was meant to silence me now rings with song. My morning routine includes gratitude, not the weak kind that accepts abuse, but the fierce kind that comes from surviving it. I water my roses, chat with Mrs. Chen over the fence, wave to the Morrison family, Tom Kowalski's daughter Emily brings her own children for lessons now. The cycle continues, but differently, built on trust, not taken for granted. Last month, I spoke at a federal conference on elder abuse, shared the stage with lawmakers, advocates, other survivors. My words were simple. They lock us away because they think we're already gone. But we're not dead until we're dead. And even from a basement, even from a cage, we can find ways to fight back. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Never believe you deserve erasure. The house on Willow Street stands as testimony. Where Margaret saw a resource to exploit, I see a legacy to share. Where she built a prison, I built a school. Where she planted cruelty, I grow music and memory and proof that the human spirit, aged or not, refuses to be buried alive. My life is mine. My choices are mine. My story is mine to tell. And every morning, when I brew my coffee in the kitchen Margaret thought she'd stolen, I smile. She gave me 8 weeks in a basement. I gave her 8 years in a federal cell. She thought she was putting me away. Instead, she put herself away, and I emerged stronger, clearer, more certain than ever. The basement couldn't hold me. Her lies couldn't bury me. And now, in the music room where she tried to silence me forever, children learn that their voices matter, that age brings wisdom, not weakness, that love isn't proven by what you take, but by what you give freely. Margaret built my prison. I transformed it into her legacy. Not the one she wanted, but the one she earned. And that's the kind of justice that sings.